He left her pregnant for power, but 4 years later she returned with triplets, and his world shattered in an instant. 4 years earlier, Lily Harper had felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her feet. She had just discovered she was pregnant, and instead of joy, instead of the warmth of sharing such news with the man she loved, she found herself facing the bitter reality of abandonment. Daniel Black, the man who had once promised her a future full of laughter and loyalty, had chosen ambition over love. He was the picture of success even then, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of charisma that could sway a boardroom and silence competitors. But beneath the polished surface was a man consumed by the hunger to build an empire, and for him, Lily was suddenly no longer part of the plan. He told her, in words that still stung every time she replayed them, that their lives were moving in different directions, that she did not fit into the path he was forging for himself. To Daniel, it sounded logical, perhaps even merciful. To Lily, it was betrayal in its cruelest form. She had wanted to scream at him that she was carrying his child, that love was not something to be measured against profit margins and mergers, but the words stuck in her throat. Pride, that last fragile shield protecting her dignity, forced her into silence. She left without confession, without begging him to reconsider, even though every step away from him felt like tearing her own heart from her chest. Alone in the quiet of her apartment, she clutched the letter she had once written him, words of devotion and belief in his dreams, and burned it rather than let it become an unheeded plea. When she went to the doctor weeks later, trembling with both fear and determination, the news she received nearly knocked the breath out of her. She was not carrying one life, not two, but 3. Triplets. For a long moment she sat there frozen, staring at the blurred images on the monitor, her hands shaking as she tried to comprehend what fate had just placed on her shoulders. A single child had felt overwhelming enough, but 3? She was a woman with no partner, no wealth, no stable safety net to fall back on. And yet as the reality sank in, so too did an unshakable resolve. She would not give up. If Daniel believed that success meant discarding her, she would prove that true success lay not in climbing corporate ladders but in raising the lives growing inside her. The months that followed tested her strength in ways she had never imagined. She worked long hours, often until her body ached, saving every penny she could, terrified that she would not have enough to provide. Nights were sleepless not only from the weight of her pregnancy but from the heavy silence of her loneliness. There were evenings when she sat on the edge of her bed with tears running silently down her face, clutching her stomach as if to whisper apologies to the children she feared she could never give enough to. Yet for every moment of despair, there came a surge of fierce love, a determination that carried her through. She began preparing in small, practical ways, buying second-hand baby clothes, painting the walls of a nursery in soft shades of cream, and setting up 3 tiny cribs that filled the small room almost completely. Each stroke of the paintbrush, each folded blanket, was both a promise and a defiance. She had been left behind, but she would not fail them. And when she finally gave birth, after hours of exhausting labor that felt like it might break her, the sound of 3 voices crying together filled the sterile hospital room. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not from pain but from overwhelming awe. She looked at them, Chloe, Skylar, and Madison, and in their tiny faces she saw Daniel's legacy, his unmistakable blue eyes staring back at her even before they could focus. She felt as though she were holding fragments of both love and loss, gifts that bound her to him forever even as she swore she would never again depend on him. In that moment, though her body was weak, her spirit felt stronger than it had ever been. Her life had been shattered, but in its place she had been given 3 reasons to rise again. The first months after the birth blurred into a haze of sleepless nights and endless demands, and Lily often wondered if she had overestimated her own strength. Taking care of 3 newborns at once was not just exhausting, it was all-consuming, and there were moments when she felt as if the entire world had shrunk to the size of her small apartment, filled with the cries and restless movements of Chloe, Skylar, and Madison. She fed one while another cried, and by the time she soothed the second, the third needed her attention. There were nights when she barely had the energy to eat a proper meal herself, surviving on hurried bites of toast or lukewarm tea while the girls drifted in and out of restless sleep. But even in the moments when her body felt like it was collapsing, she would look down at their tiny faces, 3 pairs of impossibly blue eyes staring up at her with innocence, and she felt an unshakable sense of purpose. The outside world seemed indifferent to her struggle. Friends who had once filled her days with companionship slowly drifted away, unable to understand the weight of her new reality or perhaps too overwhelmed by it to know how to help. She was left with only herself, her 3 daughters, and the quiet conviction that she would somehow manage. She began to take freelance photography jobs when she could, balancing editing photos late into the night with the constant demands of motherhood. Sometimes she strapped the girls into a stroller and pushed them through the city to client meetings, ignoring the stares of strangers who marveled at the sight of such a young woman alone with 3 identical little girls. Their whispers hurt, but she forced herself to lift her chin and walk on as though she had nothing to prove. There were moments of desperation when bills piled up and her bank account dwindled to almost nothing, times when she lay awake with her heart pounding, wondering how she would pay for diapers, formula, or the next doctor's appointment. But she refused to let despair win. She found creative solutions, buying in bulk, accepting second-hand donations from neighbors, cutting corners wherever she could, and little by little she managed to keep her daughters clothed, fed, and safe. Every challenge she faced seemed insurmountable at first, yet each time she found a way to endure, her resolve grew stronger. As the girls grew older, her days became filled not only with survival but with fleeting, unexpected joys. There were afternoons when their laughter echoed through the small apartment, their voices blending into a melody that made her forget every sleepless night. She remembered the first time they called her Mama, in unison, their little voices rising together as if to remind her that she was their entire world. She remembered their first steps, chaotic and uncoordinated, 3 pairs of tiny feet stumbling across the floor toward her open arms. Those moments wrapped around her heart like armor, shielding her from the bitterness that might have consumed her. Yet even in the midst of love and pride, there was always the shadow of Daniel. She could not escape it, because every time she looked at her daughters she saw him reflected back, his dark hair, his piercing blue eyes, the same determined expressions that even as infants seemed to carry his mark. She told herself she would not hate him, because hatred would poison her spirit and eventually seep into the lives of her daughters. Instead, she spoke of him carefully, when the girls began to ask. She told them their father was far away, that life had taken him down a different road, but that they were loved, and that was what mattered most. Inside, though, she sometimes wondered if she had made the right choice in never telling him, if perhaps he deserved to know. But then she would remember the coldness in his voice the day he left, the way he had chosen ambition over family, and she forced the thought aside. As the years passed, Lily created a rhythm to their lives. She learned to juggle work and childcare with a precision that amazed even herself. Mornings were chaos, getting 3 girls dressed, their hair brushed, their shoes tied, and yet she found herself smiling through it, marveling at their individuality even though they looked so alike. Chloe was bold and outspoken, Skylar thoughtful and dreamy, Madison mischievous and restless. They filled every corner of her days with challenges and light, and while exhaustion never truly left her, neither did love. What she built with them was not the life she once imagined, but it was a life that belonged to her, forged through sacrifice and resilience. And though she told herself that Daniel was gone forever, there were quiet nights when she sat by the window after the girls had fallen asleep, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She imagined him in some glass tower, living a life of power and emptiness, unaware that his true legacy lived in a small apartment filled with the sound of 3 little girls breathing in unison. In those moments, she whispered silently to herself that he would never know, and she would never let him hurt them as he had hurt her. What she did not realize was that fate had already begun to weave the threads that would bring their paths back together, threads that would unravel the fragile piece she had built, and in their place, create something far stronger. While Lily's days were filled with diapers, late-night lullabies, and the constant balancing act of survival, Daniel's life moved in a very different orbit, one wrapped in glitter and noise but stripped of authenticity. He had risen higher than even he had imagined possible, the youngest CEO in his company's history, and he stood at the center of a network of power that most men only dreamed of touching. His calendar overflowed with meetings in skyscrapers, gala dinners, and private jets that whisked him across oceans, yet for all the polish and perfection, he often felt as if he were only an actor reading lines in a play he had grown tired of. His wife, Caroline, was every bit the image of what society expected of him, strikingly beautiful, perfectly poised, and always ready with a smile that looked flawless in photographs. She played her part at his side, her golden hair gleaming under flashbulbs, her hand curled delicately around his arm as though the two of them were inseparable. And yet, when the last guest had left, when the lights dimmed and the cameras were gone, Daniel found himself lying in a bed that felt colder than any empty hotel room. Caroline loved appearances more than intimacy. She adored her social calendar, her charity committees, her interviews in glossy magazines, but she had no interest in the man behind the image. She rarely asked him about his day, and when she did, her interest stopped at the results, profits, contracts, mergers. His victories were measured by numbers, and his failures were greeted with disdain. Daniel responded with silence, because what could he say? That in the middle of signing multi-million-dollar agreements he sometimes felt the hollowness so strongly it choked him? That he would sit in his office late at night staring at his reflection in the darkened glass, wondering why success had left him feeling emptier than he had ever been? Those were questions his wife neither wanted to ask nor could ever understand. In his darker moments, when exhaustion outweighed ambition, his mind drifted back to Lily. He hadn't spoken her name in years, not aloud, but her memory had never truly left him. He remembered the way she used to bring him coffee in the morning when he was buried in work, how she laughed at his most serious moods and pulled him back into the real world with nothing more than a smile. He remembered her eyes, that unshakable blue, so much like his own yet softer, warmer, as if they carried not just strength but compassion. There were nights when he wondered where she had gone, whether she had found someone else, whether she hated him or had simply erased him from her life. He pushed those thoughts aside with the same discipline he used to silence doubts in the boardroom, but they always returned, lingering like ghosts in the quietest hours. The irony was that to the outside world, Daniel looked like the man who had won everything. He was photographed on red carpets, quoted in financial magazines, admired by peers and envied by rivals. He shook hands with senators, toasted with foreign leaders, and was always introduced as one of the most successful young CEOs of his generation. But success without love had a strange taste, bitter and metallic, like drinking water from a glass lined with iron. He smiled when expected, but the smile never reached his eyes. His wife noticed, perhaps, but she didn't care. As long as the cameras adored them, she was content. Meanwhile, Lily's world, so different from his, pulsed with a kind of richness Daniel could not have imagined. She had less money, less comfort, fewer moments of rest, but what she did have was life, 3 little girls with his eyes who filled every day with laughter and tantrums, questions and hugs. She lived in a small apartment where the paint on the walls was chipped, but where the drawings of Chloe, Skylar, and Madison hung proudly, turning every flaw into a badge of love. She measured her success not in contracts but in milestones, the first time all 3 girls slept through the night, the first time they held hands and danced together in the living room, the first time they looked at her with pure adoration and called her Mama. What she had built in her modest home was something Daniel's wealth had never bought him, a sense of belonging, of purpose, of love that demanded nothing but presence. And yet, unknown to both of them, their worlds were slowly inching toward collision. Daniel's restlessness was growing too heavy to ignore, his carefully crafted life starting to show cracks beneath the pressure of his unspoken regrets. Lily's strength, while unwavering, carried with it an exhaustion that weighed on her spirit, even if she never let her daughters see it. Fate was preparing to pull them back together, not gently but with the force of a storm, and when it came, the truths buried for 4 years would erupt in ways neither of them could have predicted. The gala was everything Daniel's wife adored, towering chandeliers spilling golden light across marble floors, champagne glasses carried on silver trays by silent waiters, and a crowd of politicians, investors, and socialites whose conversations filled the air with a constant hum of ambition. Daniel moved among them with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times, shaking hands, offering practiced smiles, letting Caroline guide him from one circle of admirers to the next. On the surface he looked every bit the confident CEO, impeccably dressed, sharp and untouchable, but inside he felt the same weariness that had haunted him for years. He was performing a role, a part written for him long ago, and no one in the room noticed how hollow it felt. He had become so used to suppressing it that he almost believed he was immune to surprises, but fate had other plans that night. As his eyes scanned the ballroom, searching for nothing in particular, they suddenly froze. Across the room, near one of the tall pillars decorated with white roses, stood a woman in a flowing pale dress. Her hair, golden under the light, shimmered as she leaned down to adjust something on the child clinging to her. For a moment Daniel thought his mind was playing tricks on him, dragging old memories into a place where they didn't belong. But then she turned slightly, her face coming into full view, and his chest constricted so violently he nearly dropped the glass in his hand. Lily. It was not the Lily he had last seen 4 years earlier, trembling but proud as she walked away from him. This was a woman transformed, steadier, stronger, carrying an aura of quiet resilience that made her more beautiful than he remembered. And she was not alone. At her side stood 3 little girls in matching dresses, their dark hair gleaming, their identical blue eyes darting around the room with a mixture of curiosity and mischief. They were unmistakable, a living echo of himself, triplets whose every glance stole the air from his lungs. Daniel's entire body went rigid as the truth slammed into him. He had daughters. 3 daughters. And for 4 years he had lived his life in complete ignorance of them. He could not look away. Caroline was speaking beside him, laughing lightly as she charmed a politician's wife, but her words faded into static. All he could see was Lily lifting one of the girls into her arms, smoothing a wrinkle from her dress, and smiling softly as the child pressed her cheek against her shoulder. The other 2 clung to her skirt, tugging impatiently for her attention, and Daniel saw how naturally she balanced them, how her every movement radiated the kind of love and strength he had never witnessed in his world of luxury. It was as if the universe had placed a mirror in front of him, showing him not who he was but who he could have been, and the reflection was devastating. His mind reeled back through the years, recalling the moment he had walked away, convincing himself that ambition was worth more than love. He had told himself that Lily would move on, that she would find someone else, that his absence would eventually mean little. But standing there, staring at the 3 children who bore his eyes, he realized that his choice had not just cost him a relationship, it had cost him a family. He felt both a desperate urge to rush across the room and fall at their feet, and a suffocating fear that it was already too late. What right did he have to walk into their lives now, after abandoning them before they even had a chance to be born? Lily noticed him then. Her gaze lifted from her daughters and locked onto his, steady and unflinching. For a long moment the noise of the gala seemed to vanish, and it was only the 2 of them, caught in a silence heavier than any words. Her expression was not angry, not surprised, but calm in a way that unnerved him. It was the calm of someone who had lived through storms, who had fought battles alone and come out standing, no longer expecting anything from the man who had once broken her. She did not turn away. She held his gaze with quiet strength, and then, as if to emphasize the truth, she shifted her arms, drawing her daughters closer. Daniel's breath came ragged, and he felt a rare, unfamiliar panic stirring in his chest. Caroline touched his arm lightly, asking if he was all right, but he brushed her off with a tight smile, unwilling to reveal even a crack in front of her. He stayed rooted to the spot for the rest of the evening, stealing glances whenever he could, watching Lily and the girls until they finally disappeared through the exit. His body ached with the need to follow, but fear chained him where he stood. He told himself it wasn't the time, not here, not with cameras flashing and eyes everywhere. And yet, When he lay in bed that night beside the woman he did not love, staring at the ceiling in the dark, the image of Lily surrounded by 3 daughters who looked so much like him played over and over in his mind until he felt like he was losing his grip on reality. He understood now why his life had always felt incomplete, why the victories had never satisfied him. He had walked away from everything that could have made him whole, and in doing so, he had created a truth that could no longer be hidden. By morning he knew that nothing in his carefully constructed world would ever be the same again. Daniel barely remembered how he got through the night after the gala. He had left the ballroom with Caroline's hand clinging to his arm and the chatter of their companions swirling around him, but all he could hear was the echo of 3 little voices that had not even spoken to him, voices he imagined, voices that haunted him long before he ever heard them in reality. His mind refused to let go of the image of Lily standing with those children, their blue eyes identical to his own, their hair dark and gleaming under the hotel lights. He tossed restlessly in bed, staring at the ceiling while Caroline slept beside him, every hour dragging him deeper into an unbearable certainty. He had 3 daughters, and for 4 years he had known nothing of them. By morning he was unrecognizable even to himself. He cancelled meetings without explanation, ignored phone calls, and drove through the city with a desperation that left his hands trembling on the steering wheel. He found her address through contacts he had not called in years, people who were startled to hear from him but too intimidated to ask questions. When he finally stood at her door, the weight in his chest felt like it might crush him. For the first time in his life, the man who had faced down billion-dollar negotiations with steady confidence was paralyzed by fear. He raised his hand to knock, let it fall back to his side, then forced himself again until his knuckles finally struck the wood. The door opened slowly, and there she was. Lily. Her hair was pulled back loosely, strands framing her face, and her eyes were as blue as he remembered, though no longer soft with love. They carried something heavier now, something that came only from years of struggle and solitude. She looked at him not with shock, not with anger, but with a weary calm that made his throat close. Behind her, he caught glimpses of a hallway decorated with children's drawings, tiny shoes scattered by the mat, the unmistakable evidence of a life he had not been part of. For a moment he could not speak. All the words he had rehearsed in his head vanished, leaving him with nothing but the raw ache of regret. Are they mine? The question tore from his chest before he could stop it, hoarse and trembling, stripped of all his usual composure. Lily held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she nodded once. Yes. They are yours. Her voice was steady, unflinching, and it cut through him more sharply than any accusation could have. The air between them seemed to collapse. Daniel staggered back slightly, his breath catching as though the very ground had shifted. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, to demand why she had never told him, to beg for details about every year he had lost. Instead, what came out was little more than a whisper. Why didn't you tell me? This time there was no hesitation in her answer. Because you chose to leave. You chose power, status, a life that didn't have room for me. I wasn't going to fight for scraps of your attention or humiliate myself by trying to pull you back. And I wasn't going to let my daughters grow up believing they were unwanted. Her words were even, but beneath them he heard the steel, the exhaustion, the years of sacrifice she had endured without him. Daniel's hands shook at his sides, his throat tightening with shame. He had told himself for years that his choices were rational, that he had traded love for something greater, but standing there, seeing the truth in her eyes and imagining the lives of the 3 little girls he had abandoned without even knowing it, he realized the depth of his blindness. His silence had not only hurt Lily, it had stolen from him the one thing that might have filled the emptiness he had carried for so long. Inside the house came the sound of laughter, light and musical, and his heart clenched painfully. He could hear them. His daughters. The sound made his knees weak, and he nearly reached for the doorframe just to steady himself. Every instinct in him screamed to step inside, to see them, to hold them, but Lily stood in his way, not physically, but with the weight of her presence. She was the guardian of the world he had forsaken, and she was not about to let him enter it on desperation alone. "I didn't lie to you," she said finally, her voice softer now but no less resolute. "I didn't hide them to punish you. I protected us. You made your choice, and I built a life without you. They are my world, and I won't let you walk in and break what I've fought to keep whole." Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tight, his vision blurring with tears he had never allowed himself before. "I was blind," he admitted, his voice raw. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought building a future meant sacrificing what I felt, but I see now I was wrong. I see them in my mind, and I know I've wasted 4 years I can never get back." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Lily stepped back slightly, enough to end the conversation but not enough to invite him inside. Daniel understood the meaning clearly. He was not yet welcome. He had shattered the bridge between them, and if it were to be rebuilt, it would be on her terms, not his. He turned away slowly, each step down the porch feeling like a sentence handed down in silence. Driving away, he felt the suffocating weight of Caroline's world waiting for him, but for the first time, he saw it clearly. The mansion, the luxury, the carefully orchestrated marriage, it was nothing but a cage built from greed and pride. Now that he had glimpsed the truth, he knew he could no longer live inside it. That night, lying awake again in a bed that no longer felt like his, he replayed every word Lily had spoken, every sound of laughter drifting from the house he had walked away from. He knew with painful certainty that his life would never again be measured by contracts or accolades. It would be measured by whether he had the strength to fight for what he had already lost once. And he swore to himself, in the silence of the night, that this time he would not walk away. Daniel's world began to crumble the moment he left Lily's doorstep. The life he had built with such careful calculation, the marriage that had once seemed like a brilliant alliance, the empire he had wrapped around himself like armor, all of it felt suddenly fragile, as if the smallest push could shatter it into dust. He returned home that night to Caroline waiting for him, her glass of wine balanced delicately between manicured fingers, her expression already sharp with suspicion. She had always known when something had shifted in him, not because she cared for his heart but because she monitored control like a hawk. She asked where he had been with a smile that was more accusation than curiosity, and Daniel, still reeling from Lily's words and the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing in his mind, answered with silence. That silence was the beginning of the end. The days that followed became a battlefield. Caroline confronted him with venom in her voice, demanding to know who had stolen his attention, accusing him of betrayal before he even confessed the truth. When he finally told her, calmly, simply, that he had discovered Lily again, that he had children, that he intended to be a father, her composure cracked into hysteria. She screamed about humiliation, about how he would ruin them both in the eyes of the world, about how her family would never forgive such a scandal. Her anger filled every corner of the house, and Daniel stood unmoved, realizing for the first time that her fury no longer frightened him. He had lived for years trying to preserve appearances, bending his life to avoid chaos, but the storm had already come, and he welcomed it because it meant truth was finally tearing through the lies. The divorce unfolded like a public war. Caroline used her influence to paint herself as the victim, sobbing in interviews about the cruelty of a husband who abandoned her, planting stories in the press about his so-called infidelity and betrayal. For weeks Daniel's name was splashed across headlines, his face scrutinized by journalists who speculated about his downfall. Investors called him, allies questioned him, even board members hesitated in their loyalty. But for the first time, Daniel didn't care about the noise. He showed up at meetings when he had to, gave short statements to contain the chaos, but his mind was always elsewhere. He was no longer fighting for reputation or power, he was fighting for the right to step into his daughters' lives. Caroline tried to hold him hostage with threats, claiming she would destroy him financially, that she would strip him of everything he had worked for. But Daniel had already calculated the cost, and he was willing to pay it. What were companies, estates, or headlines compared to the 3 little girls who had his eyes? He would have given it all up without hesitation. That resolve broke Caroline more than anything else, because she realized she no longer had leverage over him. The man who once prized ambition above all else was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized, someone who had found a reason to live that existed outside of the gilded cage they had shared. When the divorce was finalized, it was not victory that Daniel felt but release. He left the courtroom with his shoulders lighter than they had been in years, stepping into the cool air as though it carried the first breath of his true life. He drove not to the office, not to a celebration, but to the quiet street where Lily lived. He did not knock that day, he only sat in his car and watched the faint glow of lights from her window, listening in his imagination to the sounds he had heard before, children's laughter, the warmth of a home. It was enough to remind him why the storm had been worth enduring. Earning Lily's trust was harder than enduring Caroline's wrath. Lily did not slam doors in his face or hurl accusations, but her guardedness was sharper than any blade. When he asked to see the girls, she agreed cautiously, her voice calm but filled with warning. He understood she was not giving him a gift but testing him, making sure he was willing to do the work, to prove with action what words could never repair. His first visits were brief, filled with awkward silences and tentative steps. He brought books he thought they might like, toys he chose with uncertainty, feeling out of place in the small but vibrant world Lily had created. The triplets looked at him curiously, 3 sets of identical blue eyes studying him as though trying to place him in the puzzle of their young lives. The first time Chloe asked him to read a story, his voice shook so badly he stumbled over the words, and all 3 girls laughed, not cruelly but with the bubbling innocence of children who delighted in everything. That laughter broke something inside him, not with pain but with a sudden rush of joy so pure he nearly choked on it. Skylar climbed into his lap uninvited, and Madison tugged at his sleeve, demanding her turn to sit with him. Their acceptance was so immediate, so unguarded, that Daniel had to fight back tears. He realized then that children were not like adults. They did not measure worth in money or in years of absence, but in presence, in warmth, in the simple willingness to kneel to their level and listen. Lily watched from a distance, her arms folded, her expression unreadable. She did not interfere when the girls tugged Daniel into their world, but neither did she soften immediately. She needed to be sure this was not another temporary detour in his life, not another moment of passion followed by abandonment. Daniel knew this and respected it. He came back again and again, never missing a day he promised, never allowing business to serve as an excuse. He learned to braid hair clumsily, to build towers of blocks only to laugh as the girls knocked them over, to sit cross-legged on the floor and draw crooked animals with crayons staining his fingers. Every evening spent with them was a redemption, every hug a reminder that he still had a chance to build what he had once destroyed. The scandal of his divorce faded slowly from the headlines, replaced by fresher stories, but Daniel didn't care. The world could write what it wanted. He had stopped living for it. What mattered was that when he walked into Lily's home, 3 little girls ran toward him with smiles as bright as the sun. What mattered was that Lily, though cautious, began to look at him differently, no longer as the man who had left but as the man who was trying, truly trying, to return. It would take time, perhaps more time than he deserved, but he had finally learned patience. He had finally learned that the only empire worth building was the one that waited for him in that small home, painted in crayon drawings and filled with laughter. Daniel's transformation did not happen in a sudden burst of redemption but in the quiet, painstaking rhythm of everyday life. At first he stumbled through the role of fatherhood, unsteady and unsure, a man who had spent years making decisions that affected thousands yet found himself paralyzed by the small but monumental choices of raising 3 little girls. The triplets, however, did not measure him by the standards of his past. They didn't care about his reputation, his wealth, or the mistakes he had made before they were born. They cared only about whether he showed up when he said he would, whether his eyes softened when they looked into his, and whether he sat on the floor with them and gave them his full attention. He began to find himself in those small moments. One evening he arrived with a bag of hair ties and ribbons, determined to learn how to braid. The task was humbling, his large hands clumsy against the fine strands of their dark hair, but the girls giggled with delight at his failed attempts. Madison declared her braid looked like a twisted rope, Chloe told him he needed much more practice, and Skylar simply kissed his cheek and said she liked it anyway. Their laughter filled the room, warm and bright, and Daniel realized it was the kind of sound he had been starving for all along, a sound that healed wounds ambition could never touch. Bedtime stories became a ritual that slowly replaced the emptiness of his former nights. He would sit in the girls' shared room, the three of them climbing over him as they argued about which book he should read. At first his voice was stiff, too formal, too used to commanding boardrooms, but with time he let go of that armor. He used silly voices for animals, exaggerated expressions for villains, and dramatic pauses that left the girls squealing for more. Sometimes they interrupted him with questions, their boundless curiosity spilling out in streams he could barely keep up with, and he learned to welcome those interruptions instead of hurrying them along. By the time their eyes grew heavy and their breathing slowed, he found himself lingering beside their beds long after the last word had been read, marveling at how natural it felt to simply be there, not as a visitor but as their father. Outside of those moments, there were lessons in patience that stretched him in ways he had never expected. On rainy afternoons he helped them build sprawling forts from blankets and pillows, listening to their endless debates about who would be queen and who would be guard. On bright mornings he chased them through the park, his heart pounding not from business stress but from the exertion of keeping up with three small bodies darting in every direction. He knelt to tie shoelaces, wiped away tears after scrapes, and applauded every small accomplishment as though it were the greatest triumph in the world. Each task seemed trivial compared to the monumental challenges he was used to, but in their simplicity he found meaning. He began to understand that the truest form of success was measured not in stock prices but in the trust glowing in his daughter's eyes. Emily watched all of this carefully. She did not make it easy for him, nor did she offer quick forgiveness. She carried the memory of his absence too deeply, and she had spent years building a life that did not rely on him. At first she remained in the background during his visits, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorway, her gaze steady and guarded. But with each passing week, she saw how consistent he became. He never missed a promise, never treated the girls as an afterthought, never tried to buy their affection with extravagant gifts. Instead, he gave them time, attention, and the humility of a man learning everything from the beginning. Slowly, without realizing it, Emily began to let the edges of her defenses soften. She saw not the man who had walked away but the man who was fighting to stay now. Daniel's daughters grew bolder in their affection. Chloe started saving her drawings just to present them to him, her face glowing with pride when he placed them carefully in a folder as if they were masterpieces. Skylar asked him to help her plant flowers in the small patch of soil behind their building, convinced they would grow faster if he whispered to them, and Daniel found himself crouching in the dirt in his tailored suit, laughing as she scolded him for not being gentle enough. Madison began to run to him the moment he appeared at the door, her little arms wrapping around his legs before he even had the chance to knock. These small gestures, repeated day after day, chipped away at the walls he had built around his own heart. For years he had thought himself incapable of belonging, but now belonging was being handed to him freely by three little girls who had every reason to reject him but chose not to. For Daniel, every moment carried both joy and pain. Joy in the discoveries of fatherhood, pain in the knowledge of all he had missed. He often lay awake at night thinking of the first words he had not heard, the birthdays he had not celebrated, the fears he had not soothed. Those lost years weighed heavily on him, and yet he understood that regret could not be his anchor. The only way forward was to create memories now so rich, so full of love, that they would outshine what had been absent before. He vowed to himself that his daughters would never again doubt his presence, that he would be a constant in their lives no matter what it cost him. And as the seasons passed, Emily could no longer deny the change she saw. He was not the same man who had once chosen ambition over love. His shoulders seemed lighter, his eyes warmer, his laughter unforced. There were moments when she caught him looking at her with something unspoken, a longing he did not dare voice, and for the first time in years she did not push that gaze away. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was something just as powerful, the fragile beginning of trust, rebuilt slowly, brick by brick, in the ordinary chaos of raising three little girls together. The morning of the triplets' fourth birthday arrived with the kind of chaos that only children could create, and Daniel found himself in the middle of it, not as a guest or an outsider but as someone who belonged. Balloons floated across the living room, colorful streamers hung awkwardly from the ceiling, and the smell of frosting and vanilla filled the air from the cake that Emily had stayed up half the night decorating. Chloe, Skylar, and Madison were everywhere at once, darting between the kitchen and the living room, arguing over who got to wear which crown, squealing over the pile of presents stacked on the table. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching it all with a quiet ache in his chest, because this was the life he had nearly thrown away and yet somehow had been given back. He rolled up his sleeves, set aside the nerves that still haunted him sometimes, and joined them. The day unfolded in a blur of laughter and noise. The girls insisted that he sit on the floor with them to help unwrap gifts, his large hands fumbling with ribbons while their smaller ones tore through paper with impatient energy. Every time they opened something new they looked up at him first, waiting for his reaction, their eyes gleaming with pride as though his approval meant more than the toy itself. He cheered as loudly as they did, letting his voice rise above the noise, his heart swelling each time one of them leaned against him or tugged at his arm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When it came time for the cake, the three of them pressed close together, leaning over the candles with identical mischievous grins, and as Daniel helped them steady the flames, he whispered wishes of his own, silent promises that he would never again let them face life without him. Emily moved through the day with quiet grace, arranging plates, pouring drinks, making sure the chaos stayed just shy of disaster. Yet Daniel noticed the way her eyes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't watching, how her expression softened every time the girls clambered into his lap or wrapped their little arms around his neck. She had been cautious for so long, holding herself back to protect both her daughters and her own heart, but now there was something different in the way she looked at him, something unspoken but undeniable. It was not forgiveness spoken in words but forgiveness lived in the way she allowed him into the circle of their lives without resistance. Later in the evening, when the candles had been blown out and the girls were finally worn down from hours of excitement, Daniel carried each of them one by one to their beds. Chloe fell asleep against his shoulder, her crown slipping into his hand as he laid her down gently. Skylar mumbled drowsily about the flowers she wanted to plant in the spring, her tiny fingers gripping his until she drifted off. Madison, the last to surrender, fought her sleep with stubborn energy until Daniel promised he would be there in the morning, and only then did she let go, her breath evening out as he tucked the blanket around her. Standing there in the dim glow of the nightlight, watching the three of them curled together in peace, Daniel felt something inside him settle. He had spent years building towers of glass and steel, chasing victories that dissolved as soon as they were won, but here was a triumph that would never fade. When he stepped back into the quiet living room, Emily was waiting for him on the couch, her hands folded loosely in her lap. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence was not heavy this time but warm, filled with the sounds of children breathing softly in the next room, with the faint smell of birthday candles lingering in the air. Finally Daniel sat down beside her, and when his hand brushed hers, she did not pull away. He turned toward her, his voice low but steady, telling her that he wanted to build more than moments, that he wanted to create a future with her and the girls, not out of obligation but out of love that had survived despite everything. He admitted that he could never erase the pain of the past, but he would spend the rest of his life proving that he had changed, that he had finally understood what mattered. Emily listened without interrupting, her eyes steady on his, and then she let out a breath that seemed to release years of unspoken weight. She told him that she was tired of carrying anger, tired of protecting herself so fiercely that she risked missing what was right in front of her. She said she wasn't promising perfection, but she was willing to try, for their daughters and for herself. Daniel felt her hand tighten slightly in his, and for the first time in years he allowed himself to believe in something more than redemption, he believed in hope. As the night drew to a close, they stepped out onto the small porch together, the cool air wrapping around them, the city quiet beyond. Daniel looked at Emily, her hair catching the faint light, her face calmer than he had seen it in years, and he realized that this was what home truly meant. It wasn't the mansion he had left behind or the status he had sacrificed, it was this simple moment, the knowledge that inside the house were 3 little girls sleeping peacefully, secure in the love of both their parents. He reached for Emily's hand again, and this time she intertwined her fingers with his fully, no hesitation, no distance. In that gesture lay the truth of everything they had endured. The years of pain had not broken them, they had reshaped them into something stronger. For the first time since he had lost her, Daniel allowed himself to feel at peace.